Welcome back for Lesson 7 in World History 1. Today we're going to talk about ancient Greece. If you're following along in your textbook, it is in Chapter 5 of World History. We have several objectives for Lesson 7, including describing the art and culture of Ionian and Mycenaean Greece, compare and contrast Sparta and Athens, explain the concept of Greek democracy using primary sources, discuss Greek literature and poetry, analyze both the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars using primary sources, detail the works of key Greek philosophers, trace the career and impact of Alexander the Great in spreading Hellenistic culture, and exploring the various artistic, political, and written contributions of Greece that have endured and influenced other cultures. You'll notice that some of these objectives do say using primary sources. So you do have some online readings that are primary sources written during the time that will help you understand the Greek culture a little more. As we talk about ancient Greece today, we're not just talking about the Greek mainland or modern day Greece. So we need to look at what the Greek world is during ancient Greece. So we will look at geography and topography. The Greece that we know today is united, but Greece will not be unified under one ruler into the 4th century BCE. So what did ancient Greece look like? During this time period that we're talking about today, there were several independent city-states, and they're called a polis. So each independent city-state is a polis, and there are 1,500 of these independent city-states. Two examples are Athens and Sparta. Each of these independent city-states had their own government, their own law codes, armies, gods, and cultures. And we'll talk more about different independent city-states as we move forward. Today we're talking about the Greek world. So if we went and pointed Greece out on a map today, it's much smaller than what the Greek world included during ancient Greece. The Greek world included modern-day Greece and extended to Italy in the west and into modern-day Turkey and Ukraine in the east. And we know that the geography and topography of the Greek mainland and the Mediterranean islands will shape the people that live in these areas. It will shape their history and how they practice agriculture. So if we turn to the Greek mainland, we know that it is very mountainous. And this will have an impact on how the people that live there survived. The mountains actually help some areas be isolated from other areas. An example is Thessaly. Then we can turn to another area, the Isthmus. If we look at the Isthmus, it is strategically located and it allows Corinth, an independent city-state or polis, to play a very important role in controlling the Isthmus. And then you also notice in this map that there are several islands in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas, and these islands make up the Greek archipelago. Because of the different topography and different land, the Greek world has different agriculture, different resources in different areas. Mainland Greece was really unsuitable for agriculture. Remember, it's really mountainous. Many of these mountainous regions actually focus on herding over agriculture. But one thing that they were able to grow in mainland Greece, and it was very important to ancient Greek culture, were olive trees. Olive trees produced olive oil, and it was important for eating, bathing, and producing oil for lamps. So oil was a very important commodity in ancient Greece. Precious metals were not abundant and in short supply on the mainland, and that has an impact on Greek society. Over time, there are silver mines found in Attica. And we can move on and look at the Aegean, and the Aegean Sea has several islands in it, and this makes up part of the archipelago. The Aegean Sea is filled with all these islands that make up this archipelago, but we will see that the Greeks will colonize into the archipelago and into the Aegean Sea in the 7th and 6th century BCE. So this is really what we're talking about when we are looking at the Greek world in ancient Greece. So what are the time periods we'll be talking about when we talk about ancient Greece? We will be looking at these periods of ancient Greek history: the Bronze Age, the Ionian Age, Mycenaean Age, the Dark Age, Archaic period, Classical period, and Hellenistic period. So we're going to be looking at from around 3300 BCE to about 30 BCE. Today, we will try to understand ancient Greece And to do that, we need to look at methodology to understanding early Greek history. There are really two categories that tell us what we know about the ancient Greek world. We know more about the ancient Greek world by looking at literary and scholarly sources, and we also know more about it because of archaeology. Archaeologists have excavated several items from the ancient Greek world, and we're able to look at those items and look at the material culture. What did these Greek people use these particular items for? And that tells us a little bit more about early Greek history. So let's start out by looking at literary and scholarly sources. These could range from nonfiction to scholarly sources. Probably one of the most famous authors, and he's really a oral tradition author, is Homer during this time period. Homer composes these epic poems. There are two of them, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they're very important to Greek history. They are epic poems. There is a major theme that runs in both of these epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey: personal honor. And if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you can learn more about people in Greek history, including Agamemnon and Achilles, and several battles as well. Other sources that we have are major sources from Athens. One reason we know a lot about sources in Athens is because Athens was a center of culture during the ancient Greek world. We do have a few sources from Sparta, but there are fewer sources from Sparta because Sparta really focused on warfare rather than culture. Other surviving works include works from Plato and Aristotle, and we'll talk more about Plato and Aristotle in a moment. And we also know about the Hippocratic Corpus. Have you ever heard of the Hippocratic Oath? There will also be some people that want to study ancient Greece. They want to know more about ancient Greece, and they lived during this ancient Greek period. So these are the historians of the time, and they range from Herodotus, Thucydides, and they write on the history that they are living through or the recent history or the recent past, and we'll talk about Herodotus and Thucydides as we move forward. There are some limitations of written sources. There's only so many of them. Some of them are, like I said, nonfiction, some of them are histories, but there are limitations. So, where we can't find information about early Greek history, we have to turn to archaeological data and things that archaeologists have found. So, archaeologists have excavated several sites in ancient Greece and they've pulled up several different items. If you read your chapter for this week, you read about a cup of Nestor. And this cup of Nestor is something that is from ancient Greece, and it tells us more about ancient Greece culture, and we understand material culture because of these archaeological finds. So if we find something in an excavation, we can look at that item and say, what did these ancient Greek people use this item for? Did it have an artistic purpose? Was it just a piece of farming equipment? Etc. And this is material culture, what the people are using the items for. So in the previous slide, we talked about methodology, so how we know about ancient Greece. We talked about literary sources and scholarly sources. There were some limitations. There weren't that many female perspectives in those sources. They also were written by people of a similar socioeconomic background. So, how do we learn more about Greece and its history? We look at archaeology, but we could also look at mythology. So, when we're talking about mythology, we're talking about the myths that people believed in ancient Greece. And so, there's a link between mythology and the myths that the people believe and their history in the ancient Greek world. If we look at individual city states, so a polis, a lot of these different polises have foundation myths. So they have stories about how these individual city states are created. We could also turn to mythology and understand the different patron gods and goddesses of ancient Greece. In addition to this, we learn even more about warfare during this time period, and the history of the Trojan War is often intertwined with mythology. So, if we look at the Trojan War, there are several myths, but there's also history involved in that as well. So the Trojan War is fought between 1194 BCE and 1184 BCE. That was during the Late Bronze Age. And two historians, Herodotus and Thucydides, actually write histories that include the Trojan War. So they tell this story and this history of the Trojan War, but they intertwine information about mythology and history. This mythology and history that's related to the Trojan War. We've also talked about Homer in the previous slide, but Homer also will talk about the Trojan War. And if we look at Homer's versions, we look and see that there are themes in his epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He talks about personal honor, as I said. That's very important in these two epic poems. But also, he will talk about something called Kleos. And basically, what Kleos means is eternal glory. All Greek heroes want to be the best, even if they're fighting in the same army, they see each other as competition. For example, Achilles, he has to think about this Kleos. He has to think about eternal glory. He can either live his life and not be a hero, or he can die in battle as a young man and have this eternal glory. Achilles chooses to die in battle as a young man, and he's still talked about today. So, this is a little bit how mythology and history are tied together when we learn more about the ancient Greek world. There are people living in Greece during the Neolithic Age, but historians don't really talk about Greece much until they get into the Bronze Age. During the Bronze Age, we'll be talking about a period called the Minoan period. And so let's take a look at the Minoan period. The first literate civilization in Europe actually emerges on the island of Crete, and these people are called the Minoans. The Minoan period was from around 2000 BCE to 1450 BCE. The people get their name for the king of Crete, King Minos. And he's probably most famous because he was the king that was supposed to have a creature called a minotaur, a half man and half bull. And there were four major palaces on the island of Crete, and there was a lot of culture in Crete. They actually have two written systems in Crete. They have hieroglyphics. It's a specific type of hieroglyphics, and it's specific to Crete. And they had linear A script, so they had two specific writing systems. In addition to that, archaeologists have uncovered artwork, and a lot of the artwork that is surrounding the Minoan period, there are bulls depicted in this artwork. So this suggests that bulls hold a prominent place in Minoan mythology and religion. But like I said, there were these four major palaces. You can actually visit one of the major palaces today. It's called Knossos. It's been restored and reconstructed so that you can actually visit it and understand more about the Minoan period. But we know that they had a lot of culture. They had mythology, and bulls were very significant to their culture. We do see a decline of the Minoan age around 1450 BCE because there was an outside attack. After the Minoan period, we will see a period called the Mycenaean period. It is also during the Bronze Age. But the Mycenaeans were not on the island of Crete, they're actually on the mainland of Greece. And they thrived from 1600 BCE to 1100 BCE. They received their name from a palace, and it was supposed to be the home of Agamemnon. And if you know anything about Greek mythology or Greek history, Agamemnon is the leader of the Greek army in the Trojan War. And archaeologists have actually gone around and actually done several excavations, and they know that the Mycenaean people were a prosperous civilization. They had elaborate pottery, bronze weapons and tools, they had jewelry and precious metals and gems. They've even found something called the Mask of Agamemnon. It was a burial mask that a aristocratic person was buried in, and it was made of hammered gold. But it gets the name Mask of Agamemnon because of the name of the culture. They also had their own written language. It was called Linear B. But they also declined due to attack. There was an attack on the Mycenaeans beginning around 1200 BCE, and they'll eventually have a series of attacks, and they gradually abandoned the site. After the Bronze Age, which included the Minoan period and the Mycenaean period, we'll see a new period emerge called the Dark Ages in ancient Greece. This Dark Ages range from 1100 BCE to 700 BCE. It is a period of poverty, instability, disruption, and a loss of literacy among the people in the Greek world. We see a decline in overall material wealth and life expectancy. We even see a whole writing system that was used by the Mycenaeans disappear. Linear B completely disappears. But that does not mean that Greek culture disappears or that the Greek world disappears. They actually create a new writing system. It's called the Phoenician writing system, and this is an example of the Phoenician writing system. And this will be the system of writing that the Greek world uses for a while. Also, during the Dark Ages, Greek culture really thrives. This is the Homeric age, this age of oral tradition where people tell oral stories. And we will also see Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, come out during the Dark Ages in the Greek world. We can also talk about these independent city-states that we talked about very early in this lecture. An independent city-state during this time is called a polis. There are about 1,500 independent city-states in ancient Greece. If we're thinking about a city-state, there literally is a city and a surrounding area. And if we think about it in a modern day sense, we would think about a modern day county. So if you think about Douglasville, you could think about Douglas County or Carrollton and Carroll County. Think about it more as a modern day county. The people are a compact group of people. They have similar cultures, similar laws, similar gods or goddesses. And these independent city-states have particular areas that have a purpose for the polis. They have an acropolis, which is a defensible hill, and it also houses a place of worship for the gods or goddesses. You also have agora, which is a meeting place or public buildings for the polis. And to the sides of the agora, you will find areas for celebration, or you may find a theater. There's also an area outside of the polis, so in the surrounding area, the state part, called a cura, and it's where the farmland, pasture land, and wasteland is for the particular polis. Now, people from one polis are not friendly to people from another polis. They do not like outsiders. They want to only associate with people from their polis. There are 1,500 of these independent city-states, so there will be several types of governments used throughout the ancient Greek world. There will be monarchs, aristocracies, oligarchies, democracies, and a tyranny. So, you could either have a king, a rule by the elite in the aristocracy, an oligarchy where a few people rule, a democracy where the people's voice are heard, or you may have a tyrant or tyranny. The Greeks emerged from their Dark Age around 700 BCE, and they enter a new period called the Archaic Greek period. It lasts from around 700 BCE to 480 BCE, and people in the ancient Greek world will have growing connections throughout the ancient Greek world. And the people that live in the ancient Greek world view themselves as citizens of an individual city-state. So they are from one polis, and they have an identity that is connected to that one particular polis. So we want to learn more about how the Greeks moved from a dark age to a new period, archaic Greece. And one way to do this is by looking at archaeology and evidence from archaeological finds. Today, we have a vase that was made in the mid 7th century BCE. It's called the Kiji vase. And if you look at the top left, you will see the Kiji vase. It was made in the mid 7th century BCE, and it tells us a little bit about this changing time from the Dark Ages to the Archaic period. If we look at the decorations on this vase, there are battle scenes. Two armies of warriors with round shields, helmets, and spears are in formation, and they're preparing to attack one another. This vase, the Kiji vase, really tells us about warfare during this time period. It is supposed to be one of the earliest examples or artistic portrayals of the hoplite phalanx. This was a new type of fighting that emerges during this time period, and it is very important as the polis emerges, because the polis will have citizens that will fight for their particular polis, and they will be the soldiers that make up these formations. So let's take a look at what the hoplite phalanx is. The hoplite phalanx is made up of two things. The hoplite is actually the soldier. They're farmer soldiers that fight for their polis. They provide their own weapons and equipment. If we look at their armor, they have a helmet, a breastplate, shin guards, and a round shield. Their weapons, they have a short sword and a 9-foot long spear. The total weight of the equipment they're carrying around is around 50 to 60 pounds. Phalanx part is the fighting formation. They're about up to 1,000 men long and up to 10 or 20 men deep. They overlap their shields to create a moving wall of soldiers. If you look at the bottom left-hand side, you will see an example of a hoplite's phalanx. And serving as a hoplite is often linked to citizenship, serving your polis. Citizenship in most ancient Greek city-states is connected to military service, and for this reason, women are actually excluded from citizenship of a polis for the most part. During the Archaic period, we also learn more about Greek religion. Each polis often has their own god or goddess that they favor. During the Archaic period, we can learn a lot more about the ancient Greek religion. We actually see some of these independent city-states putting more significance and emphasis on religion. They have particular gods and goddesses that they worship. So each polis may have a different god or goddess that they favor. We know a little bit about how gods and goddesses play a role in Greece by looking at some of these epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we know that Zeus would be the king of the gods and also the god of weather. He's associated with a thunderbolt. His wife, her name is Hera, and she's the patroness of childbirth. Poseidon was the god of the sea. Athena was the goddess of war and wisdom, and she was a patroness of woman's craft. Ares was the god of war. Apollo was the god of the sun. So there are a lot of different gods and goddesses in Greek mythology, and we learn more about them when we study the Archaic Greek period. Another thing we're able to learn more about during this time period is the oracle at Delphi. So a lot of times people will go to the oracle at Delphi to ask questions or to offer a sacrifice, to consult the oracle and ask a question. The historian Herodotus actually records that around 630 BCE there's a king, and he actually travels to the oracle to offer a sacrifice and ask the oracle question. And the oracle responds to him, but he doesn't respond in the way the king thinks that he should. The oracle actually tells him to start a colony in Libya in North Africa. And the king ignored the advice because he didn't even know where that was, and it led to a 7-year drought. So a lot of people will go and consult the oracle at Delphi, ask the oracle questions, and they find that it's very important to listen to the oracle because it might influence the outcome of what happens to their specific city-state or their population. Archaic Greece is a time period where different city-states interact with one another, and one way we'll see this is a new identity emerging, a pan-Hellenic identity emerges, so this Greek identity will emerge. One way this is achieved is because these Greek city-states are interacting more often. One example is the Olympic Games. They start in the year 776 BCE. They are a game dedicated to the god Zeus, and athletes will compete. Several different city-states will send competitors, and even people from Persia will send competitors to these Olympic Games, and they interact with one another and build this pan-Hellenic identity. Not only that, people from city-states actually pledge a truce during the Olympic Games, so no fighting can take place during the Olympic Games. But that's one way that this pan-Hellenic identity emerges. As far as trade goes during the Archaic era, the population on the mainland of Greece is really struggling by this point. They have a hard time growing food, so they're actually going to look outside of mainland Greece. They're going to look in the larger Mediterranean world and in the Aegean Sea to look for different places to trade for food goods. But this will actually have unintended consequences that will lead to colonization in these areas, particularly in the Aegean area. So our first example of a polis in archaic Greece is Sparta. During this time period, Sparta was all about warfare. They actually began a war against their neighbor, Messenia, in 735 BCE, and they continued fighting with Messenia for 20 years. Once they conquered the Messenian land, they take the land and they actually conquer the people, and they make the Messenian people slaves, and they call these Messenian slaves Helots. So Helots during this time period are Spartan slaves, and they were conquered. They originally came from Messenia. Eventually, the Helots are tired of being Sparta's slaves, and they revolt in 650 BCE. And it takes Sparta 30 years to end this Helot rebellion. Over time, there will be some reform in Sparta. Reforms of Lycurgus. He believed that all citizens should have legal equality. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. But he also implemented reforms that say Sparta should have no family life. The government should actually raise the Spartan children, and you'll actually read about some of this in your sources for this week. The boys are raised in herds, but we do know a little bit about gender roles, and if we take a look at Spartan womanhood, it's particularly interesting. The young girls, remember, they're not being raised by their family, they're being raised by the government, so they go to a military-style training program. They get married around the age 18 to 20 years old, but marriage occurs when a woman is captured and raped. They're actually expected to raise 3 boys to adulthood, and husbands control all matters in Sparta. So Spartan culture lacked a lot, but it was based on warfare. You're actually going to read more about Spartan womanhood this week in your online readings. So our other example of a city-state, or polis during this time period, is Athens. Athens will actually take a step toward democracy during this time period. So rule of the people. So to talk about Athens, we will look at some of the leaders. Cylon, and he actually attempts to take control of Athens and become a tyrant, but he will be defeated. And there will be another leader that emerges eventually named Draco, and he's an aristocrat who is asked to write a law code system for Athens, and it's actually going to be a harsh law code that forms a constitution. If you've ever heard of draconian law, Draco writes that. There are a lot of severe punishments in the draconian law system, including death as a penalty. There's a lot of peasant unrest after Draco's laws are passed because a lot of the peasants fear the severe punishment. For instance, debt forced farmers into slavery. So if they were in debt, they would become slaves. So some of these peasants that are in debt, they actually run away from Athens. They're afraid to live in Athens during this time period. So there will be a reformer that emerges, and his name is Solon. And he emerges around the time period of 594 and 593 BCE, and he is there to reform the laws. He's actually asked to solve the issue of debt and slavery. So he reforms Draco's laws, and Solon freed the slaves, canceled debt, and recalled people that had ran away from Athens. So he will recall these exiled Athenians. He rewrote Draco's laws so everyone had rights. in Athens. After Solon created this more democratic constitution, we will see other leaders emerge. Cleisthenes will rewrite a constitution in Athens so that power was given to an elected assembly. He also extends citizenship to all males in Athens. So citizenship was just for males, and Cleisthenes' constitution will be very important, and it will remain in effect until Macedonian conquest of Athens in the 4th century BCE. And this is really what forms classic Athenian democracy. There's participation of all citizens in Athens at this point. All males are citizens during this time period and they're able to participate. They actually participated in 2 different types of institutions. There was an assembly for all citizens, and then there was a law court, which citizens were assigned to be jurors on at some particular points. There's also a concept of ostracism in Athens. If someone was a problem maker or they were just causing a lot of issues, they would be ostracized from Athens. So ostracism is a 10-year exile. So people that were problem makers would be kicked out of Athens, kicked out of their polis for 10 years. And this was really hard on them because remember, other city-states do not like outsiders. So when people are kicked out of a particular city-state or they're ostracized, it's really hard on them because where do they go? They're outsiders, and these other city-states do not want them there. And this leads us to the Persian Wars. In the mid-6th century BCE, Cyrus of Persia attempts to expand his empire, and we will see the Achaemenid Empire in Asia Minor. In 499 BCE, the Greek city-states in Asia Minor will actually rebel against Persian rule, and other Greek city-states will send troops, including Athens, to help these Greek city-states in Asia Minor. And these Greek city-states eventually defeat the Persians in 493 BCE. But this doesn't mean that the Persians are just going to quit. Eventually, an invasion of the Greek mainland occurred when Darius launches an expedition into the mainland of Greece in 490 BCE. So Darius is from Persia, and the Persians are going to invade mainland Greece in 490 BCE. And this will be when we see the Battle of Marathon. So if we look at the Battle of Marathon, it will be on September 12th, 490 BCE. The Athenians will defeat the larger Persian army in the Battle of Marathon. This will be a very big Athenian victory, and it will show that the Greeks and their hoplite phalanx is very superior to the Persian army at this point in time. So that stops the first Persian War after the Battle of Marathon. But there will be a second Persian War and a second invasion. A Persian named Xerxes is going to launch a second invasion in 480 BCE. With this second invasion, the Greeks are going to organize. The Athenians and the Spartans and 70 other Greek city-states will form an alliance to fight the Persians. So there's a Greek alliance led by the Athenians and the Spartans, and there's 70 other city-states that will come together. On the other hand, the Persians will ally themselves with Thebes. And Thebes is actually seen as a traitor because it allied against the rest of the Greeks with the Persians. And one of the most famous battles during the second phase of the Persian War is called the Battle of Thermopylae. And if you've ever watched 300, you've seen the Battle of Thermopylae. There's a narrow mountain pass that stood in the way of these Persians accessing the south. This is where 300 Spartans, led by their king Leonidas, defend the pass for 2 days before they're betrayed by a local that showed the Persians a way around. Eventually, the 300 Spartans are outflanked and they're killed. Every last one of them are killed. So if you've seen 300, you've seen the Battle of Thermopylae. But there are also 2 other important battles as well that are significant. The Greeks are able to rally after their defeat at the Battle of Thermopylae, and there are 2 battles. The Battle of
Plataea.
And the Battle of Mycale is a
Plataea.
land battle, and the Battle of Mycale is a sea battle, but the Greeks are victorious. And so Xerxes is forced to sail back to Persia. Now we're going into the classical period of Greece. It's from 480 BCE to 323 BCE. We will see a time period where the Greeks are struggling for power, particularly the Spartans and the Athenians want control of the Greek world, and so they're struggling amongst each other for control of the Greek world. But eventually, they both become weak and there's a power vacuum. Let's first take a look at the Delian League. In 478 BCE, a year after the end of the Persian Wars, a group of Greek city-states are going to come together and start the Delian League. It had an aim of protecting the Greeks from Persian attack. The leading city-state in the Delian League are the Athenians. So Athens will be the leading polis for the Delian League. The reason it's called the Delian League is it first met on a tiny island called Delos. But eventually, as I said, the Athenians are really the more powerful city-state in the Delian League. So the Delian League was actually going to move its location to Athens in 454 BCE. They completely moved the treasury of the Delian League, and this really marks the transformation of the Delian League into the Athenian Empire. Some of the allies in the Delian League were not happy that the treasury was moved to Athens. Another thing that made some of the allies upset is when the treasury was moved, the Athenians actually used some of the treasury from the Delian League for their own building projects. One of these examples is the Parthenon, this temple to Athena that's located on the Acropolis. And remember, the Acropolis is a large hill in a Greek polis, and there's normally a location to honor a god or goddess. Well, in Athens, the Acropolis is this defensive hill, but they'll also build this great temple to Athena on the Acropolis. And they use some of the funds for the Delian League to build the Acropolis. And during the classical period, as I said, there's going to be a power struggle between the Spartans and the Athenians. So we'll see the emergence of the First Peloponnesian War from 460 BCE to 445 BCE. It's a war between the Spartans and the Athenians. And the Spartans and the Athenians are really battling it out for power. Who will control the Greek world during the classical period? So they're fighting one another from 460 BCE to 445 BCE. So we just saw that there was tension between Sparta and Athens. They actually had the first Peloponnesian War, but eventually there's a war emerged. It's called the Great Peloponnesian War. It lasts from 431 BCE to 404 BCE. There's actually 3 different phases of this war, but there are ongoing issues between Athens and Sparta. They're trying to battle it out to find out who is dominant in this ancient Greek world. And so over time, we will see Athens and Sparta form alliances with different people. We've already seen the Athenians have their Delian League, but there are ongoing issues, their struggle for power from Athens and Sparta. So this actually leads us to the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides tells us a lot about the Peloponnesian War. He writes a history of the Peloponnesian War. In 433, a city-state, a colony of Corinth, actually asked for protection from Corinth. They turned to Athens and asked for protection against Corinth. But the Corinthians claimed that the Athenian support violated the 30 Years' Peace of the First Peloponnesian War. So the Spartans meet at the Peloponnesian League in Sparta in 432 BCE. They meet with their allies, as Sparta voted that the peace was broken, and they declare war on Athens in 432 BCE. There will be 3 stages of the war. The Archimedean War from 431 BCE to 421 BCE is named after the Spartan king Archimedes. And he actually uses the strategy of an annual invasion of Attica at the beginning of the war. He even led the Spartan army to invade Attica in 431 BCE. and he attempted to devastate the agricultural land around the city. And fighting rages on, and eventually in 421 BCE, with the death of generals on both the Athenian side and the Spartan side, they sign a peace agreement, and this peace period will be 421 BCE to 415 BCE. But eventually the peace is broken, and another era of the war, named the Deccan period of war, will take place from 415 to 404. Athens decided to launch a Sicilian expedition, and it took much of the Athenian naval fleet to Sicily in 415 BCE. This proved to be very difficult for the Athenian navy, and in 413 the Athenian navy was completely destroyed. The same year, in 413, the Spartans renewed their fighting, and they launched this third phase of the Peloponnesian War. By 404, we will see the Great Peloponnesian War wrap up. Athens is forced to surrender in 404. But the war not only leads to changes for Athens, it also leads to change for Sparta. Both of them had a lot of manpower invested into the Great Peloponnesian War. They also had a very difficult time recovering from the cost of the war and the issues that it cost. So let's take a look at life in classic Athens. We see a birth of historical awareness during this time period. Ancient Greece created the historical discipline. We see people like Thucydides emerge and Herodotus. Herodotus is actually considered the father of history. Herodotus wrote a book called The Histories, and it was a history of the Persian War. Thucydides is also a historian, and he wrote a book on the Peloponnesian War called The Peloponnesian War. Both authors focus more on human interaction and action than attributing it all to the Greek gods. So instead of being like Homer's epics, these two men, Herodotus and Thucydides, really focus on human interaction, and we can learn more about history of both the Persian War and the Peloponnesian War by looking at them. So this is really the birth of historical awareness. We see history emerge as a discipline. We can also talk about Athenian architecture during this time period. Pericles, he lives from 495 to 429 BCE, and he actually leads Athens for 20 years. And he is the guy that took money from the Delian League to pay for the construction projects. Remember the temple that was built for Athenia on the Acropolis? He builds temples, public buildings, and theaters. We have already talked about the Acropolis. It's home of the Parthenon and the Temple of Athena. We also see the Theater of Dionysius. It's a theater at the base of the Acropolis in Athens, and it can hold 9,000 spectators. So let's talk about Greek philosophy. There are a group of Greek philosophers known collectively as sophists, and they shun speculation, and they also ignore the physical world around them. So what do they really believe in? They believe in developing practical skills that they can use in business and government. So they learn things like persuasion and rhetoric. So they don't want to speculate on a business deal or a government deal. They actually want to use persuasion and rhetoric to have a better outcome in business and government. So those are the sophists. Then you've got three men that come up with philosophies from the Greek ancient world. You have Socrates. He lives from 469 to 399 BCE, and he did not take pay for his teaching, but he only taught what he personally knew. He uses the dialectic method. He asks a lot of questions to challenge basic belief and to encourage reason. So he'll ask people question after question after question to get them to think about what they know and to use reason. So if you've ever heard of the Socratic method, there are a lot of questions involved. Plato is around from 429 to 347 BCE, and he has a different approach. He approached the gaining of wisdom as a science. He thinks that it could only be understood through training and intelligence. So learn as much as you can, and that's his philosophy. And then you have Aristotle. He lives from 384 to 322 BCE. He did not think a perfect state was possible, but he wanted to create the best state attainable. So he wanted to make things the best that he could. So how do you go about doing this? Aristotle believes that humans were social animals, and that the polis, or the city-state, was a natural habitat for people to thrive in. So this was an area where people could reach their best state attainable in the polis. So these are some of the Greek philosophies that are floating around during this time period. We also know a little bit more about women in Athens. Remember, some of these written sources don't really tell us much about women, but we do have Lysistrata that tells us about women in Athens. So we do know a little bit about women in Athens based off of written sources, but also archaeological finds. But women in Athens held no place in the assembly, and they were treated like minors. So if you think about a minor today, it's a person under the age of 18. Well, in Athens, women, no matter how old they could be 80 years old, they were going to be treated as a minor. Women would always be represented in all transaction by a man. These women were married at the age of 13, and their husband was usually about 30 years old, so their husband was normally over double their age. The marriages were arranged by men, and the primary job of a woman was to produce heirs for the polis, Athens. And there are two other groups I want to talk about. Metics. These people were people that were non-citizens of Athens, but they were living inside of Athens. They were outsiders, and they actually had to have a sponsor to live in Athens. So if an outsider wanted to live in Athens, they had to get an Athenian to sponsor them. They were required to serve in the military and pay taxes, but they could not vote or participate in politics in Athens. So they could not participate in the democracy. And then the other group are slaves. Slaves in Athens had few rights, and they worked in nearly all occupations. But the owner would make the money off of them. So these are the status of women, metics or outsiders, and slaves. Greece is changing in the 4th century BCE. In 399 BCE, Socrates is executed for corrupting the youth of Athens. Power is changing in Greece during this time period. The Spartans and the Athenians are losing power. They fought a war that was very taxing on both of those city-states. So we see a new power emerge, Thebes. Thebes is also a polis, as a city-state. Thebes has military advances during the 4th century BCE. They develop longer spears and move to a wedge formation. And the wedge formation was much stronger than previous formations like the hoplite phalanx. We also see Thebes put together a sacred band, a group of 300 soldiers, very specialized soldiers, in 378 BCE. King Philip II of Macedonia emerges, and he really transforms his military and makes it into a advanced military, and he begins expanding to conquer the Greek mainland. Philip has his final great victory at a battle called the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE. His Macedonian army defeated Athens and Thebes. And when Philip is able to do this, he focuses his conquest on the entire mainland. And now, when Philip II does this, the entire mainland of Greece is under one rule for the first time. Philip is assassinated, and his son, Alexander III, inherits the throne at the age of 20. His son, Alexander III, is often referred to as Alexander the Great. He was tutored by Aristotle, and he loved science, and he becomes the leader of the Macedonian cavalry at the age of 18. So 2 years before he becomes Alexander the Great, he is already serving in the Macedonian cavalry. He is extremely ruthless to his enemies, but he is loved by his army. His father united the Greek mainland under one rule. Alexander the Great has even larger ambitions. He invades the Persian Empire in 334 BCE, and he decides that he wants to conquer all of Asia Minor, and he's able to do this He's able to conquer all of Asia Minor, Palestine, and Egypt by 332 BCE. So in just 2 years, he's able to do that. He conquers Assyria with his army by 330 BCE, and he keeps moving. He conquers Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan by 326 BCE, and he even makes it into India. He wants to conquer some of India, but his army is tired. They have been gone almost a decade, and they decide they want to turn back. When they turn back, eventually Alexander the Great will fall ill. He dies in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 33. But he has a legacy. And so we'll look at the legacy of Alexander the Great. He left a son, but the son was pushed out of power by Alexander the Great's generals. There were 3 major generals that Alexander the Great had serving under him, and the 3 generals split Alexander's kingdom into 3 parts. Antiochus gets Macedonia, Seleucus gets Syria and Western Asia, and Ptolemy gets Egypt. And this leads us to the Hellenistic period, 323 BCE to 30 BCE. Ptolemy's section that was divided from Alexander the Great's conquest will really become the thriving part of the Hellenistic world. Alexandria in Egypt actually becomes the center of Greek culture. Cities are no longer independent, but still important trade centers throughout the Hellenistic world. Hellenistic culture is more focused on private life rather than the public world during the Hellenistic period, and we will see some progress during the Hellenistic period in gender roles. Women are given some credit in society. And during the Hellenistic period, we see Greek cultures, ideas, and religion spread throughout the world. So it's not only on the Greek mainland, but we see the Hellenistic culture in places like Egypt. And like I said, it thrives in Egypt during this time period. And we will see some Hellenistic philosophers emerge and philosophical thoughts. And we're going to look at 3 philosophical thoughts, including the Cynics, Epicureans, and Stoics. Cynics are founded by Diogenes, and they reject all the conventions of society, and they believe that the key to happiness is living with simplicity. So if you're a cynic, you want to live a simple life. Epicureans are people that believe the doctrine of Epicurus, and Epicureans believe that they should only trust what they can detect with their senses. So if you can't detect it with your 5 senses, you should not trust it. So if you can't see it, hear it, taste it, smell it, you should not trust it. Epicureans believe that the key to happiness is to withdraw from public life completely, and they did not believe in life after death because they could not see it. The final Hellenistic philosophical thought group are Stoics. Stoics study the beliefs of a man named Zeno, and Stoics believe humans must live in harmony with nature and themselves. They think there are 3 parts of life: good, evil, and indifference, and passion is the root of all evil, and it's seen as an illness of the soul. So that is ancient Greece. I'll see you next week.